They found her cabin after the thaw, but they didn't expect anyone to still be inside, let alone alive, not after a freeze like that. The snow had packed so high against her windows, it looked like the place had sunk into the earth. The roof was bowed with ice, the chimney sealed over, no smoke rising. It was one of the old kind of log cabins, half dug, half raised, built low and ugly to the ground, with the old cracks stuffed with moss and mud instead of mortar. And when the ranchers stepped inside expecting to find death, they stopped cold in the doorway, because the woman they'd all sworn off as crazy, the one they said had no chance without a man to keep the stove lit, was sitting up, wide-eyed, blanket around her shoulders, children breathing steady beside her, and a strange kind of warmth still hanging in the air, as if the freeze had stopped just short of her doorstep, as if somehow what she'd done had worked. But to understand what happened in that cabin, you have to go back before the storm, before the night the world turned white, back to when Eliza Tranter first stood barefoot in her dirt-floored kitchen with her late husband's hammer in one hand and a cracked plank in the other, and told herself out loud, "If I wait on anyone to believe me, we're dead." Her hands were raw from pulling snow off the roof again that morning. The drifts had been higher than the cabin eaves by noon, and she was running out of firewood. The children, Jacob, 7, and Lucy, 5, hadn't complained, but she'd seen the frost on their hair when they woke up that morning. And the stove, an old rusted cast-iron Franklin with a bad leg, had barely kept their corner of the room above freezing through the night. She'd burned half the chairs by now. The shelves were bare. The wagon hadn't made it back from town. Her neighbor's ranch was 3 miles off through waist-deep snow, and the wind carried voices that weren't there. That night the children slept, wrapped in quilts under the big table. Eliza stayed awake in the corner, working by the dim orange flicker of what little fuel was left. The hammer didn't leave her hand for hours. She was ripping up the floor, not all of it, just a narrow stretch down the middle, the width of a man's shoulders, the length of the room. She tore out the old planks and dug deeper than the cabin's dirt layer, ignoring the blisters, the tears from the cold. When her knees hit the frost line, she pulled a spade, widened the trench, and kept digging. 3 feet down, 4. Her breath came in clouds, but she was sweating from the effort, the rage. The men had laughed. At the town meeting, at the store, at her cabin plans. They laughed when she'd asked about subfloor heating. They'd said, "You think you can trap heat under the ground, Eliza? What you need is a strong man and a taller chimney, not holes under your house." One said it straight-faced, chewing on jerky, and the others chuckled. One offered to come warm her up if things got cold. That had been a month ago. She'd said nothing. She was done speaking with men who couldn't see past their own smoke. Now, on that brutal night, while the children slept, and the wind screamed like a dying thing outside, Eliza laid the trick her father once mentioned in the final winter, before his lungs gave out. "Heat rises," he'd said, tapping his boot on the porch one snowbound morning, "but stone stores it. If you ever find yourself out of firewood, dig low, find the heart of the earth, pack it tight, trap what warmth you can. Ain't fancy, but dirt don't lie." She lined the bottom of the trench with flat stones, then placed 4 salvaged copper pots she'd stolen from a burned-out inn last fall. Pots she hadn't dared trade or use. Pots she'd buried under the coop. She packed the trench full of ash and sand, old coals and mud, and when the wind paused, she whispered the words that had come to mean everything since Owen died. "We don't die easy." By dawn, she'd closed the floor over the trench, sealing the warmth in. Not fire, not glowing coals, but heat, real heat. Not much, but enough. Enough to keep the air from falling below what the body could bear. Enough to sleep without the shaking. Enough for Jacob to wake up and whisper, "Mama, it's not so cold anymore." But that was just the first night. The storm hadn't even started yet. The real freeze hit 2 days later, harder than the cattlemen had ever seen, harder than the winter of '73 when the ranchers lost half their herds to ice and buried hands by the dozen. This storm was like a fist, silent at first, then slamming shut without warning. And by then, Eliza's chimney was dead. She'd sealed it, on purpose, piled wet snow and old sacks and broken iron across the top of it. She let the stove die out, huddled with the children in the cabin's lowest corner, blanketing them not above, but below. She pulled up another section of floor and created a second trench, shallower but wide, filling it with hot stones taken from the collapsed barn forge. The last heat she had, everything else, wood, coal, even dried corn husks, was gone. But that stone heat held for hours, then longer still. Not warmth like a fire, but something gentler, like a breath you didn't know you still had. By the 4th day, neighbors were gone. Some fled for town, some died in their sleep. She heard the screams one night, distant, fading, then nothing, and her children slept. The cabin trick she used wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it wasn't something she learned in a book. It was born from the earth itself, from paying attention, from the kind of watching only widows and orphans do, watching how heat lingers on stones after the fire dies, how clay walls stay warm longer than wood, how cellars feel warmer even when the air above is death. She'd built her cabin like a man once, the way they all said to, but in the end, she changed it the way no man would believe. She closed the gaps, lowered the ceiling, dug the walls in deeper, built tunnels under the floor like roots, not just to store food, but to trap heat, to confuse the freeze. She let the cabin breathe downward instead of out, and that is how they lived. On the 5th day, a tree collapsed across the back, the roof cracked, the snow covered every last window. Inside, it looked like the end of things. Jacob coughed blood. Lucy was burning with fever. Eliza wrapped them in the only remaining quilt, laid them in the pit beneath the floor, and crawled in with them. The last candle had long since died. She could see nothing, feel nothing but the packed breath of her children, and the faintest glow of heat rising through her back from the stone pit she'd built with her own hands. She thought that was the end. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, it was light outside, and the silence wasn't death, but thaw. The light that woke her wasn't golden, and it wasn't warm. It was the pale light of a late winter sun, the kind that shines without heat, without promise. It spilled through a crack in the roof above the kitchen beam where the tree had broken in, dull and hesitant, like even the sky wasn't sure the storm was done. Eliza didn't move at first. Her body was numb, not from cold anymore, but from stillness, from holding herself stiff for too many days in a row. The children were under her arms, their breath shallow but steady. They hadn't stirred, not even when the timber gave way above them, not even when the ice fell like glass against the shuttered window. She blinked, her lashes stuck together. She forced herself to sit. The cabin hadn't burned. That had been her worst fear, that one last mistake, one unburied ember, would turn everything to ash. But there was no smoke, no flame, only dust, cold, dead dust, floating through the shaft of light in long, lazy lines. And beneath the floor, beneath the patchwork slats she'd torn up and relaid a dozen times, the trench still held its secret. Not fire, not miracle, just stone, old stone, and the warmth that doesn't rise fast or bright, but holds, lingers, whispers. She didn't cry, not yet. She just pulled the children close, pressed her cracked lips against their foreheads. She listened for sounds beyond the cabin, cracking limbs, wind shifting in the trees, anything. But the world was still, still in a way that felt unnatural, like a battlefield after the last bullet's been fired, like something sacred had passed and left the air thin from holding its breath. It was then, with a sort of slow dread blooming in her chest, that she wondered if they were the last. The cabin creaked as she stood, not from wind, just from her weight returning to the floorboards. She moved like a wounded thing, slow, hunched. Every muscle had locked during those final hours, and the nails in her fingers had turned purple from the cold. She'd lost feeling in her left foot 3 days back, and hadn't dared check for frostbite. But still, she moved. She pulled aside the wall plank she'd nailed over the window. The light struck her face like a slap. The snow was as high as the eaves. Her breath caught in her throat. The whole valley looked drowned, white and silent and smooth as a burial cloth. The trail to the next homestead was gone, vanished beneath a drift at least 6 feet deep. The wagon shed had collapsed under its own roof. The chicken coop was nothing but a lopsided mound. The trees stood like ghosts, weighed down with frozen limbs, and the chimney, sealed shut with snow and ice, now jutted from the roof like a dead finger pointing nowhere. She backed away, shut the plank again. Inside, the air still held, not warm, but not killing either. Somewhere just above the edge of life, the trench beneath the floor had held longer than any man would have guessed. But she could feel it now, its breath fading, a thinness creeping in at the corners of the room, under the walls, through the doorframe. It wouldn't last another night, that much was certain. So Eliza did what she always did when certainty stared her down. She moved. She pulled the last of the quilts down, stripped the rags from the pantry shelves, gathered every scrap of cloth she could find. She laid them over the floor like patchwork insulation. Then she did the unthinkable. She opened the door, or tried to. It wouldn't budge at first. She had to brace her shoulder against it, heave 3-4 times before the ice cracked, and the frame gave way. A wave of white powder crashed inward, piling into the cabin, spilling across the floor like sand. It was blinding. She coughed, backed away, pulled the children further into the corner. Then, dragging one boot behind her, she began to dig. Not for firewood. That was long gone, buried or burned or unreachable. She was digging for stone, heatless, lifeless, useless by any other man's measure. But she knew better. She had learned the way a woman learns when the world offers her no other teacher. Learned from the old country women who used to sit with her mother, pressing hot stones into cloth for birthing pains. Learned from the blacksmith's wife who once said, "Stone's like bone, cold until it remembers the fire, then it don't forget for hours." And she remembered her own father, who had once heated a hearthstone and buried it under her bed after she caught a fever that winter when the river froze solid. Eliza began dragging stones back to the house. Each one she unearthed from the buried garden path, from under the snow-packed fence post, from what used to be the smokehouse floor. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Her breath wheezed in her chest, but she moved like a woman possessed. 10 stones, then 15, flat stones if she could find them. She laid them in a circle beneath the trapdoor she'd cut beneath the stove months ago, the secret place where the trench had started. Then she did what no one would have dared. She lit the last flame. It wasn't a fire, not truly, just the smallest coal, stashed in a sealed tin wrapped in wool, hidden behind a floor beam in case the flint ever failed. She didn't let it burn open. She used it to heat the largest pan she had, pressed flat against the stones, covered with the old copper lid from the stew pot. It smoked, it cracked, it groaned like a thing dying, but the heat spread, and once the stones remembered the warmth, they held it. The children stirred. Jacob sat up first. His cheeks were grey, but his lips had color. He looked at her, said nothing, then reached for Lucy. She woke coughing, but her eyes were alert. She clung to the quilt, then to her brother, then to her mother. Eliza didn't speak. She pulled them both close, laid them down again, and whispered against their foreheads, "We're not done." Outside, the snow began to crack, not melt, not yet, but shift, settle. The storm had passed, but its grip hadn't fully loosened, and somewhere beyond that white curtain, something moved. The ranchers came 3 days later. They weren't looking for Eliza. They were looking for bodies. They brought with them long poles for poking through drifts and a sled for hauling out the dead. They'd lost half the valley. The preacher's wife had frozen to the floor of the chapel. The Simmons boys had tried to make a run for town and never returned. Even the fur trader, old Clarence Hogue, had burned through every scrap of beaver and then gone silent. So when they came to the Tranter cabin, they expected the same. They tapped the roof with a pole, heard no response, figured the place was empty or worse. But something stopped them from breaking through the door. It was the window. One of the boards had shifted, just slightly, and behind the gap they saw movement. A hand, not flailing, not weak, a steady hand, lifting the board aside. A woman's hand, and then her face, pale, drawn, but alive. They stood in stunned silence as she opened the door. She didn't greet them with tears. She didn't fall into their arms. She stepped aside, let them in, and gestured to the children asleep beneath the quilts, their breath still fogging the air. Barely, but enough. One of the men, Dan Grissom, later said the strangest part wasn't that she'd survived. It was the heat, that when he stepped into that ruined old cabin, he could feel the faintest warmth in the floorboards beneath his boots. Not from fire, not from coals, but from below, from something buried. And he remembered how she looked when he asked what she'd done. She only said, "What I had to." Later, they tried to explain it. Some said she'd found a hot spring. Others said she'd tricked the cold with insulation, buried the cabin like a cellar. A few claimed it was divine, a punishment for not listening, a miracle maybe, but most didn't speak of it at all, because the truth was worse. She'd done what none of them had. She'd looked the storm in the eye, and she'd prepared not by fighting it, but by knowing it. That was the trick, and no man had believed it. They left her alone after that, not out of cruelty, not quite out of shame either. It was something quieter, a silence born of discomfort, like the way people avert their eyes in church when a widow walks in dressed in black. They admired her, yes, but admiration laced with unease, as if her survival had cost her something unnatural, something not meant for folks to understand. That kind of quiet can hang around longer than a grave bell. And out there in the frontier, where gossip lasted longer than bread and pride burned hotter than firewood, it meant more than anyone said out loud. After the thaw, they offered help. A few hands came by to clear the collapsed shed. Someone brought a wheel of cheese, someone else a smoked ham, but no one asked about the trench. No one mentioned the stone heat or the buried pots. And Eliza, for her part, never volunteered a word. It wasn't bitterness that made her quiet. It was memory. Memory of nights that had no shape, only the constant shiver of waiting to see if breath would fog again. Memory of frost forming on the ceiling beams, of coughing that sounded too wet, of wind that talked like a man through the cracks. She had no use for explanations. She only had her children, and those children had her. But even when winter loosened its grip on the valley, spring didn't come fast. It never does after a freeze that deep. The ground stayed hard. The water in the creek near her cabin ran slow, choked with slush and mud. Trees leafed late, and the town, it had changed, not in ways you could point to on a map, but in the way folks walked, talked, looked at the sky, as if something fragile had broken in them, something they hadn't realized they were leaning on. And beneath that change was a truth that no man wanted to speak aloud, that the only one who had truly survived out there, unaided and unaided by choice, was the woman they'd all ignored, the one with the low door and the strange stove and the eyes that didn't blink when men spoke. So Eliza kept to herself. Spring came late, but it came. The pass thawed. The ranch trails opened again. Wagons rolled through. Town resumed its shape, and yet no one rebuilt quite the same. Chimneys were dug lower. Some homes added cellars, not just for food, but for sleeping. A few men even asked at the trading post about stones, flat stones, dark ones that held heat. And one boy, just 16, was overheard saying he'd sleep under the floor next winter, like that crazy widow did. But no one said her name. Eliza Tranter became a kind of shape in people's minds. A lesson, a warning, a story that parents would bend to fit their children's questions come next December. And that suited her just fine. But stories, when left alone too long, tend to twist. And not all stories stay buried. It was the sheriff who came first. He didn't knock, just stood by the open gate one late April morning with his hat in hand, boots muddy from the trail. His face was older than it used to be, not just in skin, but in the way his eyes didn't seem to rest on anything too long. He'd lost his brother to the freeze, found him stiff in a barn with a blanket around his dog. There was a hollow in the sheriff now that hadn't been there before. Eliza spotted him from the porch. She didn't move, just watched. "Morning," he said. She nodded. "Was hoping to ask something?" She crossed her arms. He cleared his throat. "Some of the boys down in Three Rivers, miners mostly, they heard the story about your place, about how you made it through. They've got families in shacks. Winter's always worse up that way. Asked if I'd come and see if you might teach it, whatever it is you did." Eliza stared at him. "Not magic," he added, awkward. "Just the cabin thing, the trench." Still, she didn't answer. "They'll pay." That made her blink. "You think I did it for money?" "No, I think you did it to keep your kids alive. But folks up there, they'd give anything to do the same." Eliza looked down at her hands. They still bore the faint marks of frostbite. The nails were dark at the edges. Her knuckles cracked easy now. She flexed them once, twice. "Why do they care now?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. "Because men died," she said, not softly. "And I didn't." He shifted. "It's not like that. It's exactly like that." Silence again, wind through the moss chinking in her walls. But then she looked past him, out to the road, toward nothing and everything. "Tell them to come," she said, "but not to ask me how to build a fire." He looked confused. She stepped down from the porch, walked past him. "They want to live like I did," she said, looking him full in the face. "Then they need to unlearn the way you all build houses. Unlearn everything about comfort. Learn to feel heat the way you feel breath. Slow, quiet, from the bones, not the skin." He just watched her, speechless. "Tell them to bring shovels." By mid-May they came. Not many, just a few families. A miner's wife named May with twin daughters, a logger's widow from Cedar Vale, a preacher's niece. They arrived like pilgrims, shoulders squared, wearing shame and hope in equal measure. Eliza didn't greet them with sermons. She showed them the trench. By then she'd dug a new one, deeper, wider, not beneath the cabin floor, but outside, under the old shed where the earth had once stored beets and carrots. She'd roofed it low with thick logs, layered moss and clay over the top, sealed the corners with tallow. Inside, it was always 10 degrees warmer than outside, even with no fire. She called it her slow room. She let the women sit in it, feel it. One cried, another just nodded and whispered, "We were never taught this." Eliza said, "No, you were taught to hope a man could chop enough wood." In the months that followed, others came, not many, but enough to make the town uneasy. They called it a cult in whispers, said she was building something strange, that she spoke of heat like it was alive, that her children went barefoot too long into autumn, slept on dirt floors by choice, ate hot meals from stones warmed under blankets. But the women who learned from her, they weren't looking for rebellion. They were looking to survive, and survive they did. The next winter hit early. October snow, November winds that tore through fences and knocked down chimneys. Men who swore it couldn't be worse than the last one, until it was. And Eliza's students, as the town now mockingly called them, not a single one lost a child. They burrowed. They lined walls with mud and stones. They stopped chasing fires and started storing them. Heat wasn't something they fought for. It was something they trapped. They fed it into the ground like seed, kept it low, quiet, breathing, not a flicker, not a blaze, but a hum, and still no one said her name out loud, because to say Eliza Tranter's name was to admit that the old ways hadn't held, that the tallest chimneys, the deepest woodsheds, the proudest beards, hadn't saved them. A woman had. A woman with no man, no kindling, no fuel, just a shovel, some pots, and the will to stare death in the eye and dig anyway. By January, word had spread, not just in Three Rivers, or Cedar Vale, or the next county, but wider. A trader came from Arkansas, asking about the Heat Woman. A surveyor passing through on horseback stopped to see the trench. And still, Eliza refused to explain it like a science, because it wasn't. It was memory, and stubbornness, and grief turned to grit. A kind of warmth born not in fire, but in loss. She began to write, not letters, not sermons, instructions. She drew the trench, she mapped the airflow, she measured distances in arm spans, not feet. She described the thickness of mud walls by how many hands it took to press it smooth. She wrote how the heat moved, not in circles, but in size. How a room, if shaped right, could hold a breath of fire for days. And she taught the children too. Jacob learned to spot soft earth. Lucy learned how to line a pit without cracks. They both could seal a wall with moss tighter than any man's mortar by the time they were 10, because survival wasn't a secret. It was a craft, one no man had believed worth learning, until it was too late. Eliza never asked for credit, never claimed invention. She said only what her father had once told her. The ground remembers. You just have to give it something worth holding. And so she did. There was a moment, just one, that summer when the world seemed to forget what had nearly happened. The grass came back bright and thick in the valley. Children ran barefoot. Again, livestock grazed lazy in high pastures, and men started building tall chimneys again, stacking their pride upward like smoke signals. Some even tore out the stone beds they'd hastily built that past winter, replaced them with stoves from the east, cast iron with polished handles and little brass flourishes. Modern, they called it, proper. The town blacksmith, new one, younger than the last, started saying Eliza's methods were good in a pinch, but primitive. A few nodded, some laughed, the worst kind of laughter, the relieved kind, the kind that follows survival and forgets the pain that brought it. But memory doesn't die just because spring comes. It lingers in joints that ache when the air changes, in nightmares that pull you from sleep even when the night is quiet, and in those who can't afford to forget, widows, children, those who buried someone that year. It grows sharper with every careless word they hear. Eliza watched them rebuild. She didn't say a thing. She just added another trench behind the cabin. This one ran wider, branching like roots from a central pit. She called it the throat. Her children helped her lay the stones, flat shale, smooth as skin, gathered from the dry riverbed 5 miles west. They walked the whole way with baskets on their backs, returned dusty and sunburned, but they were smiling. Lucy had taken to drawing the trenches in chalk on the cabin wall, not like blueprints, but like maps, trails of warmth. She'd say things like, "This one breathes better when it's fed from both sides," or "We should move the sleeping mats toward the west pit. It holds longer." She was 10, Jacob was 12. They both moved like they'd never fully adjusted back to standing above ground. That August, Eliza started burying clay jars again, not with food, with coal dust wrapped in moss. Tiny amounts, just enough to ignite when needed, just enough to heat the pots buried nearby. She marked their locations with symbols only she and the children understood. They joked that if the cabin ever burned down, the ground itself would keep them warm. It wasn't a joke. The sheriff came back late that fall, eyes darker, face hollow. He'd lost someone else, a niece this time, drowned in a creek she tried to cross alone during a thaw flood. He didn't speak much anymore, just stood at her fence post one evening and waited until she saw him. "You still got those instructions?" he asked. She nodded. He looked down. "They're saying the snow will come early." She nodded again. "They won't listen." "I know. I might." She stepped back from the fence. "Then get a shovel." He came every other day after that, didn't wear his badge, never asked questions, just dug, hauled stone, hauled moss, sat beside Jacob one morning and asked how he kept the mud from cracking. The boy said, "Don't let it dry too fast. Warm it slow, like stew." The sheriff didn't laugh, just nodded like it made perfect sense. More came, quietly. Not just women now, men who'd lost brothers, a boy who'd watched his mother freeze by a collapsed stove, a fur trapper with a frostbitten ear and a guilt-strained voice. None of them talked much, but they worked. Eliza's cabin stopped being a home that season. It became a kind of underground school. No blackboards, no bells, just dirt, breath, and the slow rhythm of survival. They dug not to escape the cold, but to understand it, because by now they all knew Another freeze was coming, and this one wasn't just weather, it was punishment, nature's second test. It began in December, softly, like the last breath of a sleeping dog before it dies. A few nights colder than expected, a week of sky so clear it felt unnatural. Then the first storm, not huge, not brutal, but enough to close roads and cut off riders. A man froze just 10 feet from his own barn. People said it was bad luck, but Eliza didn't believe in luck. She sealed the chimney again. When Lucy asked why, Eliza just said, because the chimney doesn't feed us. That second winter was worse than the first. It didn't scream, it whispered. The snow came low and constant, not in great heaps, but in endless soft layers that covered the world like a shroud. Trees didn't break, they just bent, groaned, and vanished under the weight. Birds fled earlier. Coyotes disappeared. Even the creeks froze silently this time. No cracking, no rush. And this time, Eliza was ready. She and the children moved fully underground before Christmas. The cabin above remained, but empty, cold, a decoy. Below, in the network of trenches, rooms, and stone-lined pits they'd dug for 2 years, they lived like moles, like roots, like the very breath of the ground. Food wasn't abundant, but it was enough. Dried beans, root vegetables sealed in clay, water gathered in melted snow troughs, and heat, low, constant, humble heat, was everywhere, not from fire, not from wood, but from belief. Belief that warmth could be stored, fed, held like a secret too precious for flames. They didn't burn a single log that January. Outside, the town suffered, worse this time. The new stoves cracked from cold. The modern chimneys drew wind inward. Half the houses smoked themselves sick. A family burned their floorboards and froze anyway. No one even bothered to knock on Eliza's door. They knew where she was, knew what she'd done, and still, pride kept them away until the night the school collapsed. The roof gave out after a week of steady snow. 4 children trapped inside. 2 died before help arrived. 1 lost his legs. The 4th, she ran, all the way to Eliza's gate, in nothing but a coat and boots, bleeding, screaming. "Please!" It was Jacob who opened the trapdoor. He was the first to climb out in a week. He saw her, lifted her over the fence, carried her down into the earth like a priest bearing a relic. Eliza wrapped her in wool, pressed a warm stone to her chest and whispered, "You made it." The town arrived at dawn. Not all of it, but enough to crowd her field. Men with hats in hand, women with eyes rimmed red, children bundled against the air. They didn't speak, they just stood. Eliza emerged slowly. She looked out over them like a figure risen from myth. Pale face, dirt-stained hands, hair tied back with twine, and she said only, "The ground's already warm." They dug, together this time. The last of the moss was stripped from the creek walls. Stones were lifted from every fence. The sheriff broke apart the steps of the town hall for the flat shale underneath. Nobody protested. In one night, the valley transformed. Cabins sprouted second skins of mud and moss. Trapdoors appeared like mouths in the snow. Trenches were dug beneath beds, coals placed like seeds, and warmth trickled upward, faint but true. And for the first time in generations, no one died that February, not a soul, because one widow had refused to listen to what men said couldn't be done. She'd buried heat in the earth and dared the storm to take her. It didn't, and now, no storm would take her valley again. By the time the third winter came, no one laughed anymore. Not at the women who lined their walls with mud, not at the families who slept low, who dug trenches instead of raising rafters, who sealed their chimneys before the first snowfall. No one mocked the moss-insulated cabins now, or the warm stones tucked beneath quilts, or the strange maps of buried heat lines that children traced in the dirt like games, because those homes were the only ones still breathing when the snow came down for 61 days straight. The wind shrieked like it was tearing the names off the hills. Fence posts vanished, trees bowed and snapped, the creeks stopped moving entirely, turned to glass, then to silence. But the families who'd learned from Eliza, the ones who'd come to her fields in secret or shame, who once whispered about her like she was cursed or mad, they didn't just survive, they endured. They cooked with heat trapped days before. They slept above slow-burning clay. They told stories by the orange warmth of buried stone pits, not firelight. Some even sang, and when the ice cracked loud one night, thunder-like, splitting the hillside above the old mill road, the town woke thinking it was the end, but it wasn't. It was just the sound of an old world breaking apart to make way for something else. Eliza Tranter stood in her trench that morning, listening. She hadn't seen the sky in 12 days. The tunnel to the surface was sealed over, the snow packed high above the hatch like a grave lid, but her lungs still pulled air, deep, clean, filtered through the moss channels and stone breathers she'd designed with Jacob in the fall. The boy was no longer a boy, not really. At 13, he'd mapped more underground shelter channels than any adult in the valley. Lucy, 11, now had crafted a way to bake biscuits using nothing but the heat of 3 buried copper pans and a layered dome of clay bricks that held warmth like a hand. They were her mother's children, that much was clear. And the mother? She was more than just a legend now. She was proof that stubbornness mattered more than wood, that watching the land taught more than any book, that the old instincts, pressed down from mother to daughter, widow to orphan, were worth more than every proud chimney in the county. The sheriff returned after the snow receded again. His beard was all grey now. He'd stopped carrying a gun, said there wasn't much use for one anymore, not when the real enemy didn't bleed. He stood at Eliza's new door, carved low into the base of a hill, half covered in turf. Storm took the Richards place, he said quietly. Eliza nodded, didn't listen. They built high, he exhaled through his nose, looked down. A lot more listening now. She didn't smile. She hadn't in a long time. But there was something in her eyes, something like peace. Children in town are digging practice trenches in the schoolyard, he said after a long pause. Teacher called them tranter tunnels. He gave a dry chuckle. Would have been a hanging offense 3 winters ago. Now it's extra credit. Eliza looked away toward the woods, the sun on the frost-hardened moss. I didn't want a name on it, she said. I know. They'll forget me again someday. When the snow holds off, when men get proud again, he nodded. Probably. Good, she looked back, but maybe a girl will remember, a girl like Lucy, who sees the way smoke rises and thinks, why not go down instead? The sheriff looked at her a long time. They ever ask how you knew? Sometimes. What do you tell them? I don't. She paused. I just show them how it's done. By spring, Eliza's valley had changed in ways the maps couldn't show, not in names or borders, but in breath, in how cabins were built, how heat was gathered, how silence was understood. The people no longer feared the freeze, not because it was gone, but because they'd learned to meet it on its own terms. They didn't fight it with fire. They outlasted it with stone, patience, and the knowledge that not all warmth burns. That year they asked Eliza to come to town, just once, to speak. She didn't want to, but Jacob and Lucy insisted, so she stood on the old chapel steps, same place she once bought flour and was told she'd never last the winter, the place where a man once said she should find a husband before the cold came down. The crowd was silent, children in the front. No one carried guns. She looked over them, at their faces, some scarred, some changed, all alive. She said only this: you survived because you stopped listening to what warmth should look like. She paused. You survived because you remembered how to dig. Then she turned and walked away. They clapped, but she didn't hear it. She was already walking home, back to the low place beneath the earth where heat still lived and breath didn't freeze. The cabin wasn't pretty, but it had never been meant to be, because beauty doesn't keep you alive in winter. But knowing where the warmth hides, that does. And Eliza Tranter, she had taught them all exactly where to find it. Not in chimneys, not in wood, but in the ground beneath their feet. And that no man could ever take from them again.